So during last month, since I attended DISOT somewhere in late spring, I remember we discussed different areas of the globe like Greece, ancient Greece, Turkey, Somalia with pirates, I remember. And so now I propose you to move to Eastern Europe or Eurasia, or former Soviet Union. And I will talk about, you see the title, Reshaping Social Structure. Not just change of social structure, but purposeful reshaping for legitimation of power. So it's well known that the social structure of society in the Russian Empire, yes?
Is this
too strong or what?
no, it's not coming through.
You mean recording doesn't work? It's on. So the social structure of society in Russian Empire 100 years ago changed dramatically after Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And 20 years later that, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin announced the elimination of entire social classes of pre-revolutionary society. And 3 decades later, his successor Nikita Khrushchev, General Secretary of Communist Party, had already said that, I quote, "The Soviet Union formed a new historical community of people." What is the Soviet people? Not just people, but the Soviet people. After collapse of the Soviet Union, the social structure of societies in the post-Soviet countries also has changed dramatically. But their leaders are not yet offered a similar conception definition. So let's try to do something. So my presentation provides a comparative analysis of changes in the social structure. In particular, inequality and polarization between the state and society in those 3 countries, Slavic triangles, Belarus, Russia, and Russia, after the collapse of the Union. Its basic idea is the reshaping social structure became the effective method of strengthening legitimacy for post-Soviet authorities. Its basic thesis includes the following. Strengthening the power of leaders of the Soviet triangle countries to the great extent is due to deepening new social, economic, legal, and political inequalities based on the principle of loyalty and functionality. Second, this process has similarities and significant differences in these countries, not only how they approach inequality, but how it's perceived by people themselves. And the final, this process has strengthened authorities' legitimacy so far, but inevitably leads to growing corruption, poor governance, and social tensions and conflicts in future. As British social philosopher David Beetham noted in his recent book, The Legitimation of Power, I quote, "Where power is acquired and exercised according to justifiable rules and with evidence of consent, we call it legitimate." And he provided 3 different, let's say, approach of analysis of legitimization of power. For lawyers, he's saying that power is legitimate when its accusation and exercise conform to established law. For them, legitimacy is equivalent to legal validity. But I'm not a legal person. For the moral and political philosophy, power is legitimate where the rules governing in a justifiable according to rationally defensible normative principles. For them, legitimacy entails the moral justifiability of power relations. Most social societies, where I belong to as a sociologist in 20th century, have followed Max Weber in defining legitimacy as the belief in legitimacy on the part of the relevant social agents, and power relations are as legitimate where those involved in them, subordinate as well as dominant, believe them to do so. Legitimacy for social scientists is always legitimacy in context rather than absolutely or abstract. So we know that social structures gives life and organization and stability, any kind of structure. Admittedly, social stratification reflects the existence of inequalities in society by definition. It shows that strata exist in different conditions and people have unequal opportunities to meet their needs. German philosopher Max Weber, in addition to the economic property and income level that was known since ancient time, suggests such criteria of social stratification as social prestige, inherited and acquired status, and belonging to certain political circles, hence power, authority, and influence. That's very important to take in mind for my further analysis. Russian sociologist Peter Sorokin, who, by the way, immigrated to the United States after Bolshevik Revolution, in addition to stratification structures close to Weberian, introduced the notion of social mobility, defined as any transition of individual or social object from one social position to another. By horizontal social mobility or displacement means the transition of individual from one social group to another, located at the same social level. Vertical social mobility refers to relationships that arise when a person moves from one social layer to another. Depending on the direction of movement, vertical mobility is defined as an upward and downward mobility. This is social uplift and social descent. So I'm providing you sort of framework in which we'll analyze the data and the different tendencies in these three country societies. Loyalty. Yeah, through the history, there were various dimensions for making social inequality: racial, ethnic, religious, and many others. When we speak about authoritarian rulers, they use a particular dimensions, loyalty to them. And loyalty is grounded by providing various benefits or advances for such groups that we consider as mechanism of reshaping social stratification, including legal mechanism, through consolidation, expansion of power. It could be from constitution to, government statement, whatever. Political, what does it mean? What does it mean, this mechanism? Creation a new ruling elite, that is appointing people for leading position by principle of personal, or in some cases, institutional loyalty. Economic, increasing funding. And social, increasing social welfare for some precise social groups. So let's very briefly research methodology that I used in this work, analysis of legal documents in all these three countries, social economic statistics, opinion experts, and of course, sociological surveys. As Vladimir Gimpelson is a Russian famous economist, and Daniel Treisman is American political science. So they conducted analysis of data of more than 100 countries. And as they stressed, perceived inequality, not the actual level, correlates strongly with the amount of redistribution and reported conflict between rich and poor. We suggest, I continue quoting, that most theories about political effect of inequality need to be reframed as theories about effects of perceived inequality. So it's not enough to say that, you are rich, I'm poor, or whatever, but how people, what is their attitudes to them? Do they agree with them? Do they follow? Are they not happy? Or so on. In a sense, you see, this is a continuation of Max Weber approach. And these guys analyzed those, let me stress again, over 100 countries of the globe through this prism. And following these five classical type of social structure, from type A to type B. What is interesting when, if we speaking about, strengthening complexity or, first of all, complexity, through the time, we could, generally speaking, of course, there are a lot of deviations. We could say that historically, when we're looking backward, the move was from type A, let's say, what's typical for ancient, I'm not sure for ancient Greece, but for ancient Egypt for sure, to the modern type of American society, or especially Scandinavian type, at least D or maybe even E. So the move is there. That was evolution. Yeah, that's why if D is more or less American to Scandinavian, we could say, of course, with some, exceptions, so on, that maybe they are going further and they may be close Norwegian or Swedish to ape E then, a different one. But anyway, my major point is the direction of move, from left to right. This is through the history, 10,000 years ago, not vice versa. So let's speak briefly about the countries. Start from Belarus. So the first Belarusian president was elected by majority, 80% of voters for those who part election, 25 years ago actually, not 2.5, but 25 years ago, in relatively free and fair election. The secret of his victory was that his program and the very political image did meet the expectation of majority. His supporters dominated almost all social and professional groups in Belarus. Military, civilian, workers, peasants, engineers, teachers, entrepreneurs, journalists, many of them. And that's why allowed expert to call this election the electoral revolution of that time. And Alexander Lukashenko, his name, considered himself the people's president, promised to protect those downstairs. So sort of related kind of Robin Hood. That's why people of that time call them Batka, which means in Russian father. Let's take a look on the data. We should constantly, will I speak about legal issues or economic, but we should take in mind those dimensions of perceived inequality, how people looking and see these phenomena in their society and themselves. So this is results of comparative results of opinion polls conducted by independent institutions in Belarus in 2006 and decade after. No, you see, that was formulation of the question. In your opinion, whom president rely on the most? What we see, what is the difference at any case? No, when we not speaking about some peculiarities, generally speaking, government civil servants was less than 70%, as people think that president and the authorities rely on those groups, and 1 decade later is over 82%. Some particular groups, like presidential executive, rise from 37 to almost 55, and state bureaucrats from 20 to 32, and vice versa. The people, with the people, the first, was the American declaration, downward from almost 67% to 32 in people, in public perception. I'm not speaking about some, economic or whatever objective indicators. Some could say, so what? People see changes in the society, and all societies are evolving, so what is the matter? So what's important for us is, to identify what people feel about that when they're watching those evolution. Another, read it by columns. So there were 4 questions about those groups, about those changes in stratification. The first question was, how do you assess the financial situation of the following groups? Let's compare first to government, civil society, and the people, the most social groups that changed. So what people think? The first group, good position, 95, absolute majority. The people, bad position, 65. Does the standard of living the following groups correspond to their service to the society? They live better than deserve, the first group, 82. They live worse than deserve, the people, almost 80%. And what is the impact of the following group of people's life? Almost 60%, they say the first group is strong, and almost 3/4 of the people, none. And are the following group respected in society, as we could expect? No. So they are wealthy, they are strong, but not respected. It was the last year when the institute could, conduct opinion poll in the country. As Andrei mentioned, introducing myself, it was shut down. The network. You mean before that? Yes, we have data, not particular then. If you're interested, I can, send you. Yes, there were change in that direction. So those groups that, No, to different extent, not to that extent as here. When we speak about Americans, I don't know, French people or Norwegian people, not to that extent. So, as a result of reshaping social stratification, the number of employees in public administration, let's move to some objective indicators again, and law enforcement officers has grown by half in Belarus. I'm still speaking about Belarus. At the end of the 90s, over 160,000 of the former and over 100,000 of the later. Finally, Lukashenko turned from the president of the common people, marginalized by the communist elites as they perceived themselves at that time. That's why he was elected by majority votes. To the president of his own elites, a kind of new praetorians. a group of about 1 million people with family members for less than 10 million people country. It's a huge social group, big strata, sort of class, led by their boss and ready to ensure their interest by any means. One more results of how people perceive that public opinion poll. Again, the gap is 10 years. Which of the following instruments of the state built on Lukashenko do you agree with? You see, the first two, interesting, the change. It is my state, it protects my interest, so it's decreased, and it's only partly my state, it doesn't protect my interest, it increased. So it means those change, people understand, accept that table I have already shown you, that something wrong, something not in their favor. Just examples of reshaping social stratification sort of mechanism, legal mechanism. Remember, I formulated 4 different. For example, what kind of mechanism, what kind of events or documents I'm speaking about. For example, in late 80s, there was introducing a short-term contract system when the employer is not obliged to renew the labor contract after the expiry of its normal and annual term. It keeps them, as we used to say, on the short leash. Because Belarus has one of the highest share, over 43% of public sector employees. It means most of employees are there. And you have your contract, not tenure like here, 5 years or until, your retirement period. 1 year, from year to year to year to year, it means that employers could, make some sort of pressure or asking you to do something, to vote, for example, for that candidate, not to vote to another candidate, and so on. Political. Appointing people for leading position by principle of personal loyalty. What does it mean? It's a very abstract thesis. Including former officials who were charged in corruption crimes. I have not enough time here, to provide you the particular examples, but I have plenty of them. I can write a book about only examples of this kind. Some, for example, the deputy of general prosecutor of the country was charged for corruption, I don't remember, 6 or 7 years behind the bars, and after 1 year he was released. Lukashenko mercied him and appointed him, not in the general prosecutor, to another level. And there are a lot of this kind of political appointee, because those guys, despite they were directly involved in corruption, it was proved by maybe prosecutor office itself, they still there, because they are personal loyal to the president. Economic wages for the state officials and law enforcement some years ago was increased 3 times in 1 year, and doubled in total. Social, for example, what does it mean, social mechanism? Increasing social welfare for the state officials and abolishing of benefits for dozens of thousands of other groups. For example, when we speak about Belarus, students and Chernobyl accident liquidator. I think you've heard about Chernobyl accident 30 years ago. There was a lot of consequences, and dozens of thousands of people were involved. We call them liquidator. Many of them, died because of cancer, and there was a special social welfare for them. Abolished. So let's move to Russia. When I was speaking about silent revolution, social revolution, in case of Belarus, this best definition is rising from knees that Russians are like to speak about themselves today. Reshaping social stratification in Russia significantly differ from Belarus. Since collapse of the Union in December 1991 and until Putin era, the main engine of this process, according to many national experts, were radical and liberal political, legal, and economic reforms, early 90s, until 1998, under Yeltsin. But this way, the ruling elite under President Yeltsin leadership wanted to overcome the communist heritage, reshaping. The Active Sociological Survey conducted in 2005 invited respondents to assess their social position according to 10-point scale. The lowest 10 position means the person belonged to the lowest social stratum on the bottom, in any sense, not only in terms of wages. The first is the elite. So it turned out that 6% at the time of Russians pointed the first 4 position, the first 4, not just first. And 80 saw themselves in the 4 lowest, from 7 to 10. So the social arrangement can be described graphically as a pyramid with a wide foundation and a tapering apex. Remember the side? It was B, the second one, not Egyptian. In this context, Russia looks like a society of status position dramatically shifting downwards. Its definition that was provided a decade ago, but I would say number 1 in Soviet Union, then in Russia, social science academician Tatiana Zaslavskaya, very famous for any kind of based on the data. in early 2000s, Putin, when he came to power, used reshaping social stratification for marginalizing social basis of Yeltsin family, of the previous system, and all oligarchs for their own favor. Putin stated that, I quote, main demand of the society is social justice. It was number one sort of, how to say, lozung, promise to the people during election campaign, and promised to solve this problem. While capitalism of Yeltsin era of 90s was replaced by a managed democracy instead. And the major engine of this process became the strong state under Putin leadership. So what are the results of building justice decade after? He pronounced that. Let's take a look. In 1996, the Gini coefficient, I think you know Gini coefficient, it's correlation between 10% of those who most wealth in a society and 10% on the bottom. So what is correlation? So as more Gini coefficient, as more inequality. Is it zero? It means no inequality, just quality, equal position. So you see that it changed for worse. As European Bank researcher and Reconstruction Development Chief Economist Sergei Guriev, also Russian by name, stated just 1 year ago, if you ask in Russia, well, GDP on average grew by 70% over collapse of the Soviet Union. It's true. This is very objective economic indicator. So, how many of you got 70% growth in your pockets? The answer is the top 20%, the remaining 80%, did not feel this growth. It was his not just, assessment, but result based on the big data gathered in Russia during those 27 years by this European bank. Rosstat means Ministry of Statistics in Russia. Notes increase in the bureaucratic state. Thus, the number of employees of state bodies and local self-government bodies in Russia per 1,000 employees in the economy increased from 18 to 32 in the period just within 14 years, Putin era. The total expenditure on bureaucracy has increased as well, growth almost 1/3. When Putin put camera, there were no dollar billionaires in Russia, early 20s. But 17 years later, today, the list of billionaires, Forbes included almost 100 Russians. Good empirical indicator as well. Putin's new strategy of reshaping social stratification makes focus not only on the state bureaucracy and wealthy inner circle, because you could say, hey, it happens everywhere in any country to some extent. Those who are wealthy, they're going up, those poor, going down. As British political scientist, Thomas Remington noted his book, The Politics of Inequality in Russia, I quote, as prime minister from 2008 to 2012, Putin, when he was prime minister after his first term as a president, made expanding the middle class a national priority when he announced the social justice. Remember that? But in the aftermath of mass demonstration against him in spring 2012, his rhetoric on strengthening working class families has become noticeably quiet. His whole strategy is now not promoting the interest of middle class, but the interest of lower classes and small town people, people in industrial towns that need the state that prop them up. He is not interested in being the middle class now, and his political strategy became he thinks the middle class is ungrateful, because it was major engine of those demonstrations against him, based on results of parliamentary elections. So it looks like type A even, not B. Remember this? In this case, one could probably speak about devolution rather than evolution of social complexity. But the main stake in this process is made on law enforcement when we speak about Russia, and the state security service, different to Belarus. And not only the social institution, but also the most loyal and reliable social group. There were up to 5 million siloviki, the people who belong to this social big strata. It could be police people, KGB, not KGB, but it's another abbreviation there, but there are a variety of security structures in country. Almost every 8th or 9th man in the country. The total expenditure for them amount approximately 36% of all expense from the total federal budget. In April 16, President Putin signed a decree on the creation of a new security service called Russian National Guard, Officially, it will combat terrorism and organized crime, and the number of National Guard is likely about 300,000. It's approximately 1 million people with their family members. Now, Russia is much bigger than Belarus, of course, but even for a country with 140-something million, 1 million people is a significant social group as well. Take a look on those statistics. You see how the economic mechanism of this reshaping social structure works in case of Russia. If the average is less than 30 5 years ago, 1,000 Russian rubles, when we speak about security and policemen, almost 2.8 times more. Another one. Yeah, and interesting again, let's come back a little bit for perception in people's eyes, because some could say, hey, you know, the social structure changes, maybe it's just economic reason, because police and law enforcement, they need more equipment and protection themselves and social package and so forth, rather than people, you know, in the enterprise or whatever. And based just on economic dimension, could we say about purposeful reshuffling of social structure? Only economic. So that's why let's take a look how people from those groups perceive this process, who belong to those groups. Three-star general Viktor Cherkesov, then director of one of very important Russian security service, described the significance of security people as a new leading social group in Russian society. Very frankly, let's take a look on this quote. The country experienced a full-scale catastrophe in the early 90s, after collapse of the Union. It's known that after catastrophe, the system sooner or later begins to reassemble around those parts that have managed to retain certain system properties. The community of people who choose to protection of the state security in the Soviet era as a profession turned out to be the most consolidated in the social plan, the most advanced, the most responsible for the work. We helped in the end to keep the country from a final fall. This is one of the meanings of the Putin era. In this is the historical merit of the Russian president. It's very frank and very, I would say, you know, in a sense, brilliant definition of, you know, the role of this group in Russian society. And this is how people perceive just ordinary people. Let's move from three-star general just to ordinary Russian. This results of Levada Center. It's independent, the most respectable survey center in Russia. You could see within first table just 2 years, from 34 to 64, into bureaucracy, and from almost 50 to 20, advantage of Russian wealth, you know. And the second is how many? 8 years. You see significant difference in public, common people perception of what's going on in social structure. This reshuffling social structure focused on concentration of power and managed democracy has strengthened authorities' legitimacy so far, as we see by Putin's racing, for example, but inevitably leads to serious failure in the very management and begin worry authorities themselves. Just one quote, I have a lot of them. Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, who after Putin was, 4 years president, recently stated with alarm, the system of state governance in the country is insufficient and efficient, and all of this must be changed. It's not science, it's not opposition, it's not Khodorkovsky, it's not American sociologist. Russian Prime Minister himself said about that. So it means that based on their own results of, state government polling surveys or KGB, they know what is going on in the country. Again, some could say based on that, yeah, it's interesting, maybe it's, it's pity that Russians live by this life, not like, French or American people, but why should we care? It is their internal life, and, we have our American, we have our Japanese, we have our French, we have our Ukrainian. Why should we care? The answer of that is that what is really aimed at strengthening law enforcement and state security, as I just described, becomes clear from the new military doctrine of the Russian Federation signed by President Putin just 4 years ago. For the first time, he introduced this doctrine, official document, a number of new, rather internal than external threats to the state. military doctrines, including, there I know, many of them. The activities of information influence of population, especially young citizens in the country, which was to undermine the historical, spiritual, patriotic tradition in defense of fatherland. For example, American-sponsored Radio Liberty or whatever kind of influence to the Russia, it's subject of this kind of response. Use of external funded and run political forces and social movements. For example, if United States or France or whatever provided some funding for, let's say, independent groups of observers in Russia during election campaign, this is subject of that article, of the military doctrine. So, as a famous Russian writer Anton Chekhov wrote, if a gun is hanging on the wall, in the third act of the performance, it should shoot. The swift rise of law enforcement and security as a social institution and class, as described by 3-star General Cherkesov, led the country to the ideology of rising from the knees and the doctrine of the Russian world, that I guess familiar to you. This is external expansion threatening the outside world. Examples: annexation of Crimea, military action in eastern Ukraine, Syria, and who knows what happened tomorrow with Moldova, for example. So examples of mechanism of reshaping, there are a lot of hundreds of them, just to remind you. For example, legal, what does it mean? How it works in practice. Following a serious terrorist attack in one Russian city, Volgograd, some years ago, an anti-terrorist package of bills was adopting, reinforcing the FSB, its new abbreviation of KGB, major security service, including the right of arbitrarily examine transport and citizen. Also, Russian parliament approved amendments to the law on the police, which allow shooting at women in the crowd. It was forbidden before that. Political, interesting, use of election for promoting their own and excluding strangers, according to Ruskaya Planeta. In the past 5 years, more than 100 mayors have been dismissed from their posts or convicted of crimes, corruption. All of them, what was the reason? All of them ran against the ruling party, United Russia, led by Kremlin, and these candidates won. Do you understand what I'm speaking about? So they won during the election. There were alternatives to a ruling elite, and some weeks, months, less than 1 year, the authorities in Moscow, whatever, they found some facts to discredit them, and most of them were put behind the bus, charged in corruption, so on and so on. That's how political mechanism works for it. Economic. The total expenditure on bureaucracy significantly increased. You see the number. Social. Federal law in the Russian Federation, the civil service of Russian Federation, a decade ago, in the chapter State Guarantees, introduced a special order of pension state support with a significant higher rate of reimbursement than ordinary citizens. For example, ordinary citizens have, let's say, 25-30% of their salary before retirement, and they have 75%. Let's move to Ukraine, briefly. Despite common historical heritage and close culture, reshaping social stratification in Ukraine differs from both Belarus and Russia. Due to developed manufacturing industry and natural resources, as well as significant difference between geographic regions, for example, western part of Ukraine, bordered with Romania and Poland, and eastern part bordered with Russia, as well as significant, the country succeeded to create a variety of financial, economic, and public political actors, or groups, or social actors, I would say, in the 90s, which led to a kind of competitive balance within the society, at least on the top level when we speak about elite. If political power became a major source of wealth in Russia, and wealth did not play a significant role in political power at all in Belarus, in Ukraine, wealth became an important source of political power. So vice versa. In Russia, when you have power, you have wealthy. In Ukraine, when you have wealthy, you have power. Another important difference is that unlike Belarus and Russia, after Euromaidan, pro-democratic, pro-Europe movement in 2013-14 winter, Ukraine declared political course to Europe and democracy, which implies a reduction in inequality. A new President Petro Poroshenko, who is still president in Ukraine, rating a few months after that event was 55%, quite high. So the level of trust and expectation from your authorities to new political course, to democracy, free market economy, rule of law, Europe was very high. Comparative analysis of model of social structure of Ukrainian society, interpreted by sociologists, economists, political science, show that the majority of Ukrainian population belong to poor and very poor still. Their share in the country population is 60-70%. Second B stratum is potentially possible middle class, which comprise about 25%. The rich and very rich, according to different estimates, constitute little less than 5% in Ukraine. So it's classical pyramid, type B of the society. The data also emphasize the close correlation between social status and incomes. It's exactly social prestige and income level according to Max Weber that I mentioned at the beginning. Let's take a look on some statistics and surveys data. This result provided by World Bank. You see that Ukraine failed to build a full-fledged market economy of Western type since 2005. Ukraine was unable to raise the level of economic freedom, which should increase investment attractiveness. Change of authorities at the highest state level over the 10 years did not bring any change, at least through the data that World Bank is operating by. Level of corruption. Due to the lack of reform, the level of corruption in Ukraine remains unchanged for many years. According to the Corruption Perception Index, it's another interesting, another very respectable international institution, Transparency International. According to the Corruption Perception Index, Ukraine significantly lags behind Poland, Czech Republic, Latvia, and Hungary. More than half of Ukrainian enterprise face cases of corruption. More than half, so each second enterprise faces bribes. And the colors is era of different presidents. The first is just post-Soviet, then it was Kuchma, then what Yushchenko, Yanukovych, now it's Poroshenko. You see when you see on the graph, it's more or less remained the same level. Now you see the level of trust. Almost all state institutions do not enjoy the confidence of Ukrainians. They do not believe politicians who are trying to rule the country. So, and the trust, as we know, is one of the key concepts of democracy and market theories. It contributes consolidation of communities and public sector and accelerates cooperation and international exchange in the economic sphere. You see that the first president, the second president, no, the second, third, and fourth, Yanukovych and Poroshenko, especially last two, no, in a sense, interesting, because Yanukovych was very pro-Russian, pro-Kremlin, managed, let's say, centralized economy and so on. He was, let's say, one of the biggest oligarchs in the country. Poroshenko, different kind. He came as a president on the wave of pro-Western, pro-democratic revolution, and in the graph we see more or less the same picture. Unlike Belarus and Russia, important identifiers of loyalty to authorities in Ukraine are language and community locality. It's a little bit different phenomenon that we are facing in Russia and Belarus. Let me quote Ukrainian political analyst Michael Minakov. Elites and clans used a radical nationalist rhetoric and often alienate the Russian-speaking population. Now this is the majority, the minority. If earlier, just some years ago, before Crimea annexation, it was possible to speak of two language groups by 40-45% each. Two means Russian-speaking and Ukrainian Russian. Which, with the loss of the Crimea in the eastern Donbass, Russian citizens was smaller, and there was an effect of Ukrainian majority. It is logical to assume that in such a scheme and legislation promote of inequality, for example, language quotas on Ukrainian TV, trying to secure the Ukrainian language as the only in the public sphere, the new president's bill to introduce language inspectors for that, all this will lead to another wave of disobedience, rebellion, and new separatist projects. So you see that Ukrainian specialists are not speaking about, Russian invasion. He speaks about something that's going on within the Ukrainian society, first of all, in social structure. Belonging to the leadership community is a traditional factor of loyalty in any country since ancient time. However, in case of modern Ukraine, relationship between authorities and their native communities become much more important factor of their loyalty, as it was maybe in medieval times. What do I mean? Thus, if in the south, Nikolaev region in February last year, 2 years ago, only 7% people strongly and somewhat approve the work of the president of Ukraine in the south. and by 3% the work of the government and the parliament. In the western part, Vinnytsia region, the native to the prime minister and the president, who still has the most of his business there, the number is 31, 38, and 21 accordingly. So almost 10 times more approval of those leaders. Another quote of another Ukrainian political analyst. Petro Poroshenko follows Leonid Kuchma, under the rule of whom Dnipropetrovsk is the eastern part of Ukraine, dominated. Viktor Yanukovych, who flew to Moscow before Poroshenko, who brought to power the Donetsk, where the war is now between Russia and Ukraine. Cadres today are selected neither by their professional characteristic nor by their abilities, but by principle of community organization. Which one? See above. The region where President and Prime Minister are from, and many other ruling elite in Ukraine. Use of discrimination of social groups on the basis of nationality, language, and community, locality, and now even religious, as a mechanism of reshaping social stratification by the new authorities in Ukraine is also proved by Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, a recent polling. Thus, perception of discrimination by region of origin in Donbass, where the war is going on now, part of Donbass under Russian rules or separatist, but still under Kyiv, 13, is 3 times more than in other regions of the country. Of discrimination by language, 10%, nationality 9, 2 times more than the rest of the country. Do you follow? I speak that the most part of population in the region Donetsk, who is now fighting for independence with Russia, the level of disappointment of what's going on with the language is 3 times more than the territory of the rest of the Ukraine. And as the Institute expert stated, there were no significant difference in the indicators of discrimination in terms of language between territories that are and territories that are not controlled by Ukraine. It means what? This process is not determined by Russian support for separatists to some extent, but the origins of that are inside the domestic policy, at least for the beginning. Public perception, you could see. What is the difference in attitudes to the president and his political course between different regions? Almost nothing. Most of people in the West, in the East, consider that better to change him. Presence of companies owned by President of Ukraine Petro Lukashenko. In your opinion, be forced to resign. Again, there are some differences in the regions, but most of Ukrainians, regardless of the regions, are not satisfied with that. Example of mechanism. There are various, I have no time to clarify, but there are very particular approach in legal, political, economic, and social mechanism in Ukraine compared to Belarus and Russia. So let me come to the conclusions. Growing social tensions and readiness for change, contradictory the future. In 2006, the number of respondents in Belarus who supported the idea of maintaining the existing situation was 53, and the idea of change less than 38. Decade later, the correlation turned to 25 versus 65, when expectation for change significantly grew. More or less the same with Russia. In 2015, 44% feared constantly or afraid of becoming poor. Almost 60% felt not protected against arbitraries of the law enforcement. Only 20% believed it is possible for common man Russia to get fair trial. Some experts argue that similar process in Ukraine could not be compared with Belarus and Russia because the latter are authoritarian regimes while the former is going to Europe with democracy, which is true. However, expectation of new leadership in Ukraine that the people is ready to endure deprivation for democratic reforms longer than under authoritarian regime are not proved by reality. Just one number is according to Ukrainian Institute for Future 2 years ago, almost 60% of respondents said they could not endure any longer the worsening condition of the sake of implementation of real reforms in Ukraine. Almost 40% of them believe that there is a high probability of social upheaval or civil conflict or war. There are old approach and idea that sort of vicious circle between social inequality and corruption. Corruption leads to social equality strengthens corruption, and finally, result of those circle is the rise of populism. Again, let me quote the chief economist of the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, based on his analysis of those countries in Eastern Europe and Eurasia. The experience of our countries shows that in the short, by the way, he announced these results in Kiev just January last year, shows that in the short run people suffered first and then positive results appeared. He said, as economist who was responsible to some extent during Gaidar period in the 90s for liberal reforms in Russia. However, in some countries, suffering in the beginning led to the power of populist politicians who argued that reforms should be deployed. In some cases, these politicians managed to destroy even those imperfect democratic institutions that they managed to build, exactly what happened in Russia and Belarus. Democratic forces cannot return to power because the political system lacks opportunity for competition. This means that in the development of reforms, one should always keep in mind the maximum and widest possible distribution of gains from reform from the very beginning of the changes. Take in mind, beside all the factors that I already described, take in mind the, let's say, old cultural and to some extent psychological heritage of the population in this country, for example, in Russia, regardless of the authorities, Yeltsin or Putin or whoever. This is their perception of, let's say, choice between democratic and not democratic reform. Or, for example, when we speak about expansion out beyond Russia, it is in the very blood and mind, I would say, in millions of Russia. So it means there is sort of ground for what? And this is my last two chapters. Despite the various similarities, the Slavic triangle countries represent different model of this process, reshaping social stratification that strengthening the authorities. Post-communist Belarus represent a model reshaping social structure from the benefit, apart mobility, according to Sorokin, do you remember? Of the common people to the benefit for presidential, executive, and state bureaucrats that I described. Post-communist Russia represent a model of reshaping social structure from the benefit of oligarchy to the benefit of siloviki, those who represent military, police, and security forces, and in particular the state security service. Post-communist Ukraine represent a model of reshaping social structure from the benefit for one oligarchy to another one, accompanying by seeking to Europe and the war with Russia. So this difference. Common for them, for all three countries, is that at first stage, the leadership and ruling elites promote their legitimacy as conforming to the values of most of citizens. And at the second stage, as effectiveness of power. That is the degree to which it fulfills its function in the political system and society, according to what Max Weber and other people described at the beginning. Reshaping social structure became an important mechanism of this change because conformity to the values, first stage, implies loyalty of most of the population shared these values, while effectiveness of functionality of power, the second stage, implies loyalty of particular social groups benefited from them. This is the motivation of those who on the top to change to that direction or this direction, very selectively, very precisely. So my last conclusion is thus, one should not exclude a potential danger of the Slavic triangle for the evolution as falling into these historical tracks. Remember last two charts about Russian mentality. Quite possibly that many people in these countries understand the return of power to the people when they will be completely dissatisfied of the ruling elite policy, as overcoming the confusion and chaos, lowness, or bespredel in modern Russian vocabulary. Through what? Strengthening order, strong hand, great centralization of power, that is transition from one form of authoritarianism to another. This scenario is most likely for Russia, where authoritarian and expansionist values and practice most deeply penetrated into both the state and the society. It is also quite probable for Belarus, where authoritarianism became the most complete and stable state of the state and most part of society. But unlike Russia, Belarus tends to isolationism rather than expansionism. And this scenario should not be excluded for Ukraine as well, despite a significant part of its leadership and society shares democratic values and seeks to Europe. So my last words is that thus the legacy of the Communist Party and the previous heritage, as well as fears and deviation of the present, in particular purposeful reshaping social stratification for strengthening authority's legitimacy, make the Slavic Triangle countries present, I would say, unstable, and their future, at least contradictory. I can't say you how, based on what I'm just saying, how it will develop in the near future, but it is open. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, that was really interesting. When you were speaking, I was thinking about the Soviet Union and how you would compare the authoritarian state of the three Slavic countries to what was going on in the Soviet Union in terms of how authority was practiced there, whether it was, how it was legitimized, how different was it from this picture in the Soviet Union?
You mean in the Soviet Union compared to these post-Soviet countries?
Yes.
No,
Yes.
there were a variety of differences. First, there were not authoritarian state; it was totalitarian one. This significant difference. It was just one person, even Lenin or Stalin, not speaking about Brezhnev. There was sort of collective. It was significant difference. Let me remind you that there were, before the collapse of the Union under Gorbachev, there were 20 million members of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Even if half of them were just formally, we speak about millions of people who were directly, indirectly, at different level, involved in decision-making process and following the. Then the ideology, they tried to control the minds through the whole country, through the media, schools, and so on. And now we speak about not totalitarianism, neither in Russia, nor Ukraine and Belarus. It is authoritarian, so there are some rules that around, somehow elite and so on. Another even more important difference is there is within the authoritarian regime part of democratic institution, democratic rules. For example, election, not maybe so free like United States, I don't know, in Japan, but there was not election at all, real election during 75 years of Soviet rule. Second is economy, which is very, very important element. There was not just oligarch during Soviet Union, but private sector at all. So it means that the ruling elite could not use, for example, fighting between different groups of oligarchs as Putin changed the Yeltsin one and so there were significant difference. But of course, there are some legacy of them as well. But I tried, to strengthen. Yes, please.
I've always been a bit puzzled about, this rise of this billionaire class in Russia. And I'm actually surprised to see that they became much more numerous under Putin.
Yeah.
What is the relationship between Putin and these billionaires? Are these people that he controls, or after he has eliminated the ones he didn't like, or what is their role in society?
You already provided not only question but the answer. Of course, he does control most of them. Not just control, because we speak about control when someone appeared in our space and we somehow implement control mechanism. But when we speak about oligarchs and Putin, at least in contemporary Russia, they became oligarchs because of closeness to Kremlin and to Putin. Many of them, I had not enough time to clarify all these details, many of those 100 mentioned by Forbes journal here and others, they in early 90s or late 80s, early 90s, they belonged to small group when Putin was vice mayor of St. Petersburg, in, let's say, northern capital of Russia. And they were his close friends. And when he became president, decade after, he, let's say, provided, he took almost anything from Yeltsin oligarch, redistributed their wealth through special auctions for the huge plant, like the plant that your parents, moved to, this guy is here, to Norilsk, one of very good example It is a northern part of Russia and so on and so far. And of course, this control. And when we speak about this control, one more detail, just to explain you how it works. It is not just Putin, took someone, from the box and put it on the desk. You are oligarchs from today. It happens like I just mentioned, those were his former friends. But how it happens, when you start your business, when you are small, nobody cares from the authorities. When you are growing, when you exceed some line, some red line, some level, regardless what kind of business, it could be energy, it could be media, it could be pharmacy, whatever. If you became visible, so to go further upward, as Sorokin described in Max Weber, you have to make sort of connections with authorities. When you are in the province, you make correct connection with mayor or with the governor and so on. But when you are, on the federal level, you have to go to Kremlin, maybe not physically directly, but somehow, and to demonstrate your loyalty, and to get special sort of, how to say it was, indulgencia, how to say in English, in indulgence, in medieval times when monks, were selling different, this kind of, some could say it's not really control because they came to him, but finally it has created sort of the same control system. Yes, please.
So you mentioned after Russian occupation of Crimea, the majority in the Ukrainian part became stronger, and there was predictions that there will be more separatist movements in Ukraine.
Yes, okay. It is not my prediction, but based on what Ukrainian specialists are saying. Yes, okay.
Can you describe the logic? Because I feel like if the majority becomes stronger in Ukraine, there should be fewer separatist movements coming from within the country than.
Yeah, I've got. I see your logic. But when we speak about separatists in any country in any time, for example, Basques country in north of Spain, or Corse people in the south of France, or I don't know, Welsh people in the western part of UK or Ireland, for example, and somewhere in Ukraine it's not. What does it mean, separatist? Separate is English or Latin word, is some part of some bigger thing that wants to either special privilege or special rights or complete independence or whatever. So separatists, some part that wanted to keep distance from the majority. It is first point, very important. So in this regard, it doesn't matter who is the majority in the country. It could be French, Spanish, or Ukrainian speaking. It could be religious base. For example, Catholic or Orthodox or whoever, or Muslims. It could be language-based and many others. When we speak about Ukrainians, these guys, sociologists and political analysts, they prove these stages by data. They show that before the Crimea events, there was sort of equality in terms of language and the rights between Russian-speaking, up to 45%, remember, and Ukrainian-speaking. It remains during decades originated from Soviet time, if not earlier, in Ukraine. Sort of balance. There was some contradictions, some problems, because there were western part, mostly Ukrainian speaking, there were eastern part, mostly speaking. And what happened after Crimea was annexed by Russia, and especially when the war started in eastern part of Ukraine, the new ruling elite, led by the Kiev and president and so on, they started use this language element, as I tried to describe, based on Ukrainians, research, not my own, to strengthen their legitimation. How they started to provide some privileges from economic, legal, whatever, different, I demonstrated you different examples of this mechanism. And to limit those advantages, I would say, or benefits for Russian speaking. It could be access to be elected to the parliament, to local legislature. It could be access to media, TV, and so on, different kinds. And it is very difficult to criticize now, because if, for example, President Poroshenko would stay here, he would say, "Hey, there is a war. Russians come here, they are next part of our territory, they are killing Ukrainians and which is absolutely true. And he said, yeah, based on that, we should provide those who are loyal to us, who know around, around the flag, how to say English? Around the flag and so on. And this is Russian minority, potentially, he would maybe say. They could be sort of fifth column. The Russian and the Kremlin and Putin himself could use Russian speaking, say, hey, this is part of Russian world, we come to liberate them and help so. So it's very complicated moment, political situation, but logically and practically, as Ukrainian specialists stressed, the potential for separatist movements becomes even stronger now, because those who were more or less, let me repeat again, equal to Ukrainian speaking and Russian speaking, now they feel they're squeezing minority in different angles, different aspects. And people are not very happy of that.
Okay, thank you again.
My pleasure, thank you very much. Thanks for your patience.